Good morning, everybody. How'd you sleep? After sleeping in the church van all day on the way here, did you sleep well last night? How many of you were passed out both in the van and last night? Anybody get the double sleep? Some did. Yeah, I knew there was some. Good. Well, sleeping soundly is something that we encountered last night in Jonah's amazing story. So, thinking about where we are, I think it's best as you open your Bible to Jonah, one of the minor prophets, and they're called minor, not because they're part of a baseball farm system, but because they are smaller than the major prophets. So you open your Bible to Jonah 2. I think it's important that we think about where we've been and where we are right now. You have seen in Jonah chapter 1 something so shocking and so provocative. What you saw in Jonah chapter 1 is you saw God's spokesperson quit. You saw God's servant, the most privileged possible position that a human being could have, to be a representative between God and people, say, I'm done. I'm not doing it anymore. You saw white-knuckled defiance on display. You saw a kind of obstinance and rebellion and disobedience that should be shocking to us if it wasn't so familiar, right? And so as we saw Jonah run away from the omnipresent God, we saw God's sovereignty on display. So we saw a defiant prophet and we saw a sovereign God. And God's sovereignty in going after Jonah and in accomplishing all his purposes is equally spectacular, isn't it? I mean, to think Jonah sleeping in the hold of the ship, no idea what God's about to do, just certain that he doesn't want to go to Nineveh. He will not preach to those barbarians. He doesn't want to even have the slightest chance that God would, number one, speak to people that aren't Israel. That's a problem for Jonah. And number two, and Jonah's thinking, God forbid this most of all, that he would show his covenant love to someone that isn't the covenant people, Israel. And so Jonah runs away, and Jonah's sleeping in the hold of the ship, and God in his perfect sovereignty throws a storm unlike anything these sailors has ever seen. And in God's incredible plan, he uses this storm to convert the sailors. And so Jonah's objective of keeping the message to himself and not being a vehicle of God's salvation is already defeated. Because now we have church on a boat. The boat is breaking up, the sea is raging, and these guys turn into worshipers before our very eyes. The Jewish commentary in the Old Testament, the Mishnah, which isn't authoritative or anything, but sometimes it's interesting to see how they understood the scriptures, say that after these sailors were rescued, and after they had thrown Jonah off, and after they had paid their vows to Yahweh, the Mishnah says that those sailors from that ship that witnessed all this miraculous activity of God and then received salvation from God, both of their lives and I think of their souls as they turned to worship God, the true God. The Mishnah says they went to Jerusalem and became proselytes, Jewish people, like foreign converts. I think that's probably right. I mean, something happened to them that changed their lives. They saw the discipline of God. They saw his power. They saw his exclusive control of his creation. They saw how seriously he treated his servant. They saw what the consequences were for defying this God. I mean, these sailors have a better practical theology than Jonah does right now. And they've only known God for 2 minutes. I mean, I love their prayer, verse 14. Therefore they called out to Yahweh, O Yahweh, let us not perish for this man's life. And lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Yahweh, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. And then the men feared Yahweh exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to Yahweh and made vows. So let's say that this is the end of the story for those sailors. The last thing they saw was Jonah being thrown into a raging sea and immediately being drowned. I mean, he sunk down. And then they saw the sea become perfectly still. No longer angry clouds and lightning storms, and no longer churning waters and waves, no longer threatening to rip apart this boat. Now it's still. The ship is certainly damaged. They have just effectively killed a man, and they've had an encounter with the one true and living God. And Jonah's gone. That's all they saw. An encounter with God, and then lives that I think would be impacted by this story everywhere they went. They would go back, I assume, to the nearest port, which is likely Joppa, where they came from, and they would tell everyone what happened to them, I would think. They would explain the nature of the storm and the sleeping prophet, Hebrew man, and they'd say what he said, and then they would tell what they did and how they didn't want to throw him overboard, but they had no options, and the man seemed to be suicidal in his defiance, and so they did it, and the sea was instantly and perfectly calm. The men were fearers of Yahweh, and that's where the story ends for them. As they go back to land and tell their story, I'm sure they wondered why this happened to them. They would have been grateful for not drowning at sea like they thought they were, but they are quite sure that Jonah is dead. I mean, their story ended with Jonah drowning in the ocean. That's what they saw happen with their own eyes. And so now the story has to shift, not from the sailors' perspective, because they count Jonah as dead. But they've got to be thinking, what's God doing with us? What's God doing here? But the story of Jonah shifts to a scene that only God and Jonah and a giant sea creature can attest to. This is something that happened subterranean. This is something that happened in the depths of the ocean. Jonah undoubtedly thought he was going to die as he was thrown into the raging sea, refusing to pray, refusing to repent, refusing to obey. Jonah makes a splash. We pick up the story the sailors wouldn't have known, in verse 17 of chapter 1. And the Lord, Yahweh, appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Chapter 2, verse 1. Then Jonah prayed to Yahweh his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to Yahweh out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. And then I said, I'm driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head. At the roots of the mountains I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Yahweh my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. This is the very word of the living God. Prayer. It's very portable, isn't it? Prayer is. I mean, prayers have been offered in all kinds of places. People have been stuck in the worst possible situations. They've been kidnapped and imprisoned. They've been tortured and they've been lost. People have been freezing to death, and people have been, they won't even know where they are, and they have offered prayers. In the dark, in the winter, in the cold, in the heat, in a barren desert, people have cried out to God in extraordinary circumstances because prayer is just so portable. You always have that with you, don't you? And even if you're unfamiliar with Christianity, everybody understands that there is a kind of prayer that is for emergencies. You know that there's fire alarms in your school, and you know there's the temptation to break the glass in case of emergency, and you've always wanted to just break that glass just to kind of see what that would be like. Maybe I'm just projecting that onto you, but is there an alarm when it breaks, or do you have to hit the button, or just questions? And prayer is like that to us because there's the most prayerless person, the person who doesn't spend time on their knees before the Lord on a regular basis. When they're confronted with the threat of death or danger, they become prayers really fast. Recently, someone I love has been diagnosed with a severe form of cancer. And it has made more opportunities for prayer in the lives of some people who just don't pray. And that's because when you feel like there's no other way to go, you go to God. Jonah's hard-hearted resistance and disobedience and defiance did not drive him to prayer. It drove him away from prayer. And I know that that's what's going on in some of your lives. Maybe when you were little, your dad led your family in prayers, or you used to like to come to church and listen to the pastor pray, or perhaps with a childlike faith, you used to talk to God in your room. But the more that you've engaged in disobedience to God, the more that you've drifted away from God, the more that you've resisted God, I'm pretty sure there's a correlation in your life to a lack of prayer, isn't there? And so if someone isn't following God, they're likely not praying much anymore either. There's usually a corresponding rise between your disobedience to God and your lack of fellowship with God. And that's what's going on in Jonah's story, because you don't see Jonah saying anything to God. God speaks to Jonah, and Jonah gets up and flees to Tarshish. He has nothing to say to God. And even when these sailors beg Jonah for information, he answers their questions, but he still doesn't cry out to God on their behalf. His sinful resistance is so amplified that prayer is the last thing from Jonah's mind. Jonah is willing to die. He's entertaining it. And so he says, "Throw me in. It's time to die." But here's the thing. The Lord of all the earth wasn't done with Jonah, even though Jonah was done with God. Even a prayerless, defiant prophet is going to be the recipient of God's rescue and deliverance, but it comes through two avenues of God's sovereignty that I want to highlight for you today. In looking at Jonah's prayer, this first prayer, this most necessary prayer, this prayer that for the reader of this story is a sigh of relief. We say, finally, Jonah's coming to his senses, it seems. He's going to call out to God. He's going to do what the prophet should have done at the first, which is talk to God and release all the burdens of his soul to God and speak to God about his heart and respond to God. We see in these two avenues a highlight of God's discipline in Jonah's life, in the first half of Jonah's prayer. And then we see Jonah talking about God's deliverance. And so in Jonah's greatest and darkest moment, in his deepest despair, Jonah's going to highlight for us some lessons in God's discipline and in God's deliverance. Because the Lord of all the earth isn't done with Jonah. And I have a feeling he's not done with you. So I wonder if you would listen to Jonah's prayer, those of you who are living in active defiance against God, and adopt his prayer as your own before it's too late. Because Jonah got a second chance. And it's an awesome opportunity to see what our God is like. And he's a God who disciplines, and he's a God who delivers. And so verse 17 says, Yahweh appointed. This is the first of four uses of that Hebrew word appoint. It's not the word for create, and appoint is such a weak word because you appoint to go to the dentist, right? Like you have an appointment at Tooth Hurdy. Right? Mm-hmm. Dad jokes. Me and the Harry Potter guy. So, appointment. This is the first use of four important uses of this word in the book of Jonah. I'll show you the rest when they come. But the Lord appoints a great fish. It's not created. It's a word, maybe it's a fancy word like ordained, selected, predestined, chose and suited and fitted a fish. And this is where I could tell you lots of facts about sperm whales being large enough to easily swallow a person. And, the coast of somewhere in the Princeton Review in the late 1800s, a guy was supposedly swallowed by a fish, and he was in there for a day, and they cut the fish open, they got the guy out, and he says, "Hey, thanks for getting me out." Later, his wife would say he was lying, and it became a big thing. I'm really not worried about the scientific aspect of this. I don't think I have to explain to you. It would have been slimy in there. It would have been dark in there. I don't know how it works with mitosis and meiosis and sea mammals, and it doesn't matter to me. I believe way harder stuff than this in the Bible. I worship a crucified Jew who died on the cross for my sins and rose from the grave. I actually believe that. So the fish thing is not difficult for me. especially when I think about God appointed this fish. Like he made this fish. I mean, this fish was leading a mediocre life as a large fish in the ocean. I mean, he was probably thinking that day like, another day, another kelp bed. Why am I here, God? Probably single. Just kind of wondering, what's my life for? See, I'm more interested in that than the science side of it. And so this fish is just kind of dumping along, being a big fat fish, and he gets called up to the majors, right? It's like this fish gets a job. And unlike Jonah, the fish is more like the wind, and the fish is more like the storm, and the fish is more like the sailors. Because in this story so far, the ship is obeying God because it's determined to break itself up, the Hebrew says. The wind is obeying God. The sea is obeying God. The sailors are obeying God. And now the fish is obeying God because the Lord ordains or appoints or selects a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And there he is dumping along in the sea going, I'll always be alone. And God says, hey, buddy, calling your number. See that dude? Swallow him whole. Purpose-driven life. Hope. The whale has a job. The fish has a job, and we don't know if it's a whale. People always say whale because it's the biggest kind of fish we know. We don't even know if this is a fish, a proper fish, as far as how we define a fish with the vertebrae and the cold blood and the scales and all that. I don't know what this was. It was some sea creature that God made. Custom. At Galpin Ford near Grace Church, it's a big car dealership. I once sat in a custom Escalade made for Yasiel Puig, who is a baseball player, for a minute. Poor Puig. And it was opulent. It was, the stuff that rappers dream of. It had his number stitched into the seats. It had, fancy dubs on it. It was ridiculous. It was a custom Escalade for a gigantic baseball player. And if Galpin Ford can make that for Puig, God can make an amazing custom fish for Jonah to swallow him up, and he did. And this fish ingests Jonah. It says it was a great fish. It's just a big fish. The Hebrew word for fish is dog, which just is always interesting to me. The Hebrew word for dog is not fish. You learned a Hebrew word this weekend. Good job, guys. And so this dag, this gadol dag, this gigantic fish swallows up Jonah. And Jonah lives in the belly of this fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah thought he was going to die, but because of this obedient fish who joins the ranks of all the obedient things in this story, the wind, the ship, the sea, the sailors, the fish now all obeying God, Jonah is not at this moment singing, I surrender all. There's a storm, there's a whale, and the highlight is on God's sovereignty to save Jonah. And so Jonah finally opens his mouth in prayer. The 3 days in the belly of the fish is going to be important to our Lord in Matthew 17. We won't look at it today, but we'll look at it. Well, we look at it today, but later today. But Jonah's in there now. Jonah is sinking and dying. Death is upon him. This fish comes and swallows him whole. And it's then in chapter 2, verse 1 that it says, Jonah prayed to Yahweh his God from the belly of the fish. It was this moment, this occasion of rescue. He was drowning. Have you ever had that experience? I mean, obviously you haven't drowned. I'm talking to people who are alive. But have you ever choked on water? Have you ever been taken into the surf at the beach? I mean, there's nothing like that experience, right? To sputter and gasp and just for that second. Even if it was just, on your fruit punch. It's not fun to choke. It's bad to drown. I'm a large Viking individual, so I'm a seafarer at heart, probably in my ancestry. But I'm not like a surfer dude. And so we've had days at the beach with the kids and with the youth group in California. And there's been times when, I remember one distinctly when I took a bunch of junior high kids to the beach, and the lifeguard was doing, this thing where he's trying to get people to move a certain direction. Like all these kids are out there swimming, and he's screaming and yelling, and everyone's going like, "What's the deal?" And he's trying to move them away from where there's a current, a rip tide. And I remember, it's the only time I've really felt it, like a serious version of it, where you start feeling like you're being pulled away from the shore. It's a very distinct feeling. You have no control in that moment, and your adrenaline immediately spikes. And that's where Jonah's at. He's drowning, and it's this opportunity that God uses to bring Jonah to finally submit himself to God in prayer. He speaks to God, and it's a prayer that's overdue. And in this prayer of Jonah, he looks at it two ways. He first sings about God's discipline and prays about God's discipline, and then he has the second part about God's deliverance. And so let's look at this prayer and see what we can learn about how God treats his disobedient servant. First, with discipline, Jonah prays to Yahweh from the belly of the fish, saying, "I called out to Yahweh out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice." I mean, somewhere in the bubble, somewhere in the sputtering and the coughing and the drowning, as he descends into the depths of the sea, he realizes his folly. And he calls out to Yahweh, realizing that the sailors had worshiped better than he did, that the wind obeyed better than he did. And Jonah calls out to Yahweh in his distress and is immediately answered by an unusual vehicle of God's salvation being swallowed by this gigantic fish. Out of the belly of Sheol, Sheol's a way that they would talk about the afterlife, the grave, the depths of death. That's where he was, that's where he cried from, and that's where God heard him. And it's a reminder that even when you're undergoing the very difficult experience of being disciplined, of being chastised by God, of suffering the consequences of your sin on an earthly level, that God can still hear your voice. And this is a good time to call out to God. And sometimes that's why these things happen to us. That's the reason we need trials and afflictions and discipline in our lives. We need the wheels to fall off sometimes. We need bad stuff to happen to us because it reminds us that we need God. Sometimes when everything's going swimmingly, pardon the pun, but things are fine in your life, you drift away from a dependence on God. And you don't think about how you need him. But then something happens in your life that makes you desperate and powerless. One of your parents gets dangerously sick and put in the hospital. You have a grandparent die. You lose a close friend. Whatever it is, something tragic that happens in your life, every one of these things are opportunities for us to call out to God. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Problem of Pain, talks about how trials amplify the voice of God in our lives. He says that God whispers in our pleasures. All the joys of life, the fun things you get to do, all those speak of God. But he says God whispers in our pleasures. He goes on to say God shouts in our pain. That pain is a megaphone that God uses to rouse a deaf world. And that's true of God's discipline. And it was true in Jonah's life, his sinking into the sea, his realization that death was upon him at this very moment, that all of this had been ordained by God. Verse 3, you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. You read verse 3 and you go, wait a minute, I was there, at least in the story. God didn't throw Jonah into the sea. It says you cast me. He says to God, you cast me into the deep. Who cast Jonah into the deep? The sailors did. But on the ultimate level of the sovereignty of God, Jonah was plunged into the sea by God himself. The instrumentality of the chucking overboard, or even of the swallowing of the rescue vessel, the fish, points to the God behind it. And so we have to view the discipline in our lives, the difficulties in our lives, those things that are intended by God to make us cry out to him, to draw us closer to him, as the work of God and not of man. The instruments that God uses are various and really not the point. God is behind all our troubles. God is behind all our sufferings. God in his sovereignty is able to, without ever staining himself by doing anything wrong, he orchestrates all things for his purposes. And Jonah realizes that the reason he was drifting down into the depths of the sea, into this subterranean predicament, why he was drowning and dying, was because God was behind all of this. So much so that he says, your waves, verse 3, and your billows passed over me. And Jonah sees it, verse 4, as God's chastisement. I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The RSV translates that better, I think, as a question. Shall I then look again upon thy holy temple? In other words, Jonah's dying thought was this: it's over. I don't get to serve God anymore. See, Jonah's desire to rebel and to not serve God was answered. But as Jonah actually dies in the water, as he starts to descend down and drown, he realizes that the privilege of knowing God, the privilege of serving God, is what he's being cut off from. And it's a cost that he finally realizes is too great to bear. Shall I look again upon your holy temple? As Jonah is alone, as Jonah is descending, he's thinking of this: I'll no longer be with God's people. This isn't about Jonah's ultimate salvation, his eternal destiny, if Jonah was a Christian or not. That's not the right question. Stay in this story and you'll see that Jonah does belong to God, that Jonah is God's servant, that Jonah is one of God's chosen people. But the point is this: Jonah's disobedience had brought him to a place where he had forgotten the privileges of serving God. Sin clouds our thinking, and the discipline of God can wake us up to realize how things really are. Shall I again look upon your holy temple? The waters, verse 5, closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. This is the kelpiness and the seaweed. And I mean, this was like a sushi restaurant, but on his head. I'm at the roots of the mountains. In the conception of things in the Bible, the mountains were rooted down at the bottom of the sea. And so he's descending lower and lower and lower. I went down to the land, verse 6, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Yahweh, my God. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 6 all speak of God's good discipline in Jonah's life. And Jonah sees that discipline as a blessing from God. And we need to adopt that perspective in our disobedience, because our disobedience will lead to consequences. And if you are God's child, if you belong to God, if you are a believer, then one of the best and greatest things that can happen to you in your disobedience is the affliction of God, the discipline of God, the trials that God brings into your life, because they're going to draw you closer to Him. And that's hard to think about, and it's hard to talk about, but it's a fact. And anyone who's lived very long, or anyone who's endured a difficult trial, can testify to the truth that that trial was so instrumental in their drawing closer to God, in their increased dependence on God, and proving that their faith was real. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 11 says, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves or disciplines those he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." God's discipline is instructive. It's intentional. I have a son. His name is Owen. I like him. He's my dude. And he's 12, so we have a good time. 1-on-1 has become a challenge because I'm a slower moving land mammal. We play basketball in the driveway, and it's always been a dilemma of how, hard to go, because I was playing him hard early on. He's better than I am. I'm just going to admit that in front of you. Don't tell anybody I said that. But early on, I remember kind of, playing hard defense when he was like 7 and knocking him into all the trash cans. My bad. And I didn't want that to be his main memory. So, I kind of decided when I would play him like a man and when I would not, because I outweigh him a little, and I'm a couple feet taller than him. So, but he's gotten good, handles, he can cook, and it's tricky. And so I don't stop, I don't hold back, and I still, he's better than me. And I like to take some credit for that. But he probably gets it from his mom. So much of who we are has been formed by our parents and is a reaction to their work in our lives. But I do remember an early discipline of Owen. He was like 2 or 3 years old, and he had just done the quintessential little kid, curious boy thing where he stuck tweezers in the outlet. I don't know why. I mean, tweezers just fit in outlets. I don't know why. I think every little boy has done that. But I had to smack his hand because, he was shocked by it, but I think he was still intrigued. Like, that was cool. And so I smack his hand and I say, "No, don't you ever do that." And he cried, and and then our house didn't get burned down. So, but just that little bit of instruction was purposeful, right? I mean, it was this one little kind of reminder, don't do that. You could die. You could burn the house down. You could, that's not a good idea. You know that, right? Just so you know, too. This is instructive for you. Don't stick tweezers or any metal objects in outlets. Okay. The reason I told him that is and the reason I disciplined him is because he had to be instructed. It's because I cared about him. If I didn't care about him, I wouldn't have corrected him. He would have just kept. But that's the nature of correction. That's the nature of discipline. The Proverbs teach us that. Hebrews chapter 12 says the same thing, quoting that same verse from the Proverbs, and then it says it's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons, for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you're left without discipline in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. You see, discipline proves that God is our Father, that God loves us, that he knows what's best for us. And verse 11, for the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it. I mean, we think of discipline in a way that I think is helpful and matches the biblical use of the word paideia, the word of discipline, the Greek word for discipline in Hebrews 12. Because we say discipline is this, right? Don't do that, stop it. That's discipline. You're grounded, you don't get to have a cell phone for 3 years. You know, it happens to you all the time. It's discipline, and we get that. But we also use the word discipline like, you know, do you even lift, bro, discipline? Right? Like, I'm going to go run on the treadmill for 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and I'm going to, lift weights. I'm not going to eat 9 Chick-fil-A biscuits. I'm just going to have 3. These are just discipline choices, right? You're having self-discipline. Well, the Greek word is just like the English word. We use discipline to mean correction, and we use discipline to mean training. And those two things come together when God treats us in a way that weans us from ourselves and our stuff and points us towards Him. And God is training us and God is correcting us. And that's what God did in His discipline of Jonah. Jonah speaks of his gratitude and his devotion, and he sees the sovereignty of God behind this entire trial. And he says, in a past tense way, you have brought up my life from the pit. Jonah is confident that God is working here and that God's discipline leads to God's deliverance. That's the second half of this song. Verse 6, you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. Vav consecutive in Hebrew, it means that this is as good as done. Jonah's still in the belly of the fish, but he sees himself as rescued, not as digested, as delivered, as saved. And so his petition and his prayer is all mingled in here, and his understanding of grace is on display. God is saving Jonah from his foolishness. God is disciplining him and correcting him. And so now his attention and his gratitude is on God. Oh, Yahweh, my God. Verse 7, when my life was fainting away, I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. The temple, the place of worship, is on Jonah's mind. And his prayers are now flying with freedom out of the spout of the whale, through the ocean, through the heavens, to God's very throne room. He knows that God hears him because God answered him. Because God has afflicted him, God has disciplined him, God is delivering him. And he realizes what a place of privilege he has. Verse 8, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. There it is. Now Jonah's got it. What's going to lead to Jonah's obedience, that he will go and preach to Nineveh, is a remembrance and an encounter through the discipline of God and the deliverance of God with what's behind all of it. What's behind God's discipline in your life? What's behind God's salvation in your life? There is something that is the bedrock of all of that, of any difficulty that the Lord has brought into your life purposefully to work in you and bring you to himself, any salvation that he's working in your life, all of it has one thing underneath it, and it's located here in verse 8. It is the hope of steadfast love. That is the Old Testament's use of a little word. It's all over the Psalms. It's all over the Bible. It's the word hesed. It means God's loyal love, God's committed love, God's steadfast love. If we were to translate it to a New Testament word, we would use the word grace. God's grace is what underlies everything that we experience from God as unworthy sinners. When God disciplines us, when he chastises us, when he corrects us, what's at the heart of it is grace, undeserved favor. It's God's smile. All of that we don't deserve is pointed towards us when God disciplines us, and it's at the very heart of what's happening when God saves us. And Jonah remembers this core attribute of God alongside of his holiness and his justice, this part of God that is so precious to God's people, his hesed, his mercy, his grace, his steadfast love, God's promise that he'll never break his word, and God's commitment to love and care for his people come together in this concept that we call grace. And so Jonah sees the grace of God in his discipline and in his deliverance, in his suffering and in his salvation. Jonah understands that everything in his life is based exclusively and solely on grace, not on what he deserves, not on what he has earned, but only because he has seen the hand of God with favor and blessing, and that's the case for every single one of us. If you're breathing air in this room, that is an example of God being gracious to you. If you've heard the gospel preached to your ears, that's an example of God being gracious to you. If you have given your life to Christ, that is because God has been gracious to you and opened your eyes to see the glory of Jesus. If you have grown in your faith even this much, that's an evidence of God's grace working in you. And if you still resist him and are still running from him, it is the evidence of God's grace that you are here and not standing before God in judgment right now and not in eternal hell. All of life is grace for unworthy sinners who have everything we have is not what we deserve. And Jonah understands that and says, so many pay regard to vain idols, false gods. But he understands that his hope is in steadfast love. Verse 9, with the voice of thanksgiving, I'll sacrifice to you. Jonah finally caught up with the pagan sailors. He's going to vow, he's going to promise, he's going to be grateful. What I vowed I will pay. And then the theme verse of Jonah, Jonah 2:9. Salvation belongs to the Lord. You can't buy it. You can't earn it. You can't achieve it. Salvation is of the Lord. The unfailing covenant love of God is grace that brings about our obedience. God is the source and the giver. God is the authority and the dominion. Salvation is his prerogative. Salvation is God's business. Salvation is always undeserved. Salvation belongs to the Lord. God is sovereign. Salvation is exclusively his. That's why Jesus said, it's been granted to you to believe. Even your believing the gospel is a gift of God's grace. And so now Jonah gets it. He remembers what's true. And the focus of this passage stays on God because salvation is his. And then verse 10. Started in verse 17 with that word fish, ends in verse 10 with that word fish, framing this prayer. Yahweh spoke to the fish, this obedient fish who now lives a purposeful life, and tells him, spit him out. And he spits Jonah out on dry land. Victorious vomit. The fish spews salvation, regurgitates redemption, pukes the prophet. I could do this all day. But what a ignoble expression of deliverance. Jonah got thrown up, and he's got a new perspective. And that perspective will drive us for the rest of this day, because what rings in our ears is what rings in his. Salvation is of the Lord. And I'll show you what that means in our next session. Father, thank you for your word. Help us to see your discipline and your deliverance to be completely on the basis of your sovereign grace. God, we love you. We thank you for showing us truth that we don't deserve, opening our eyes in chastisement, in discipline, showing us and highlighting your grace in redemption and salvation. Help us to know, God, how good it is to know you wean us from the things of this world. Pull us away from the things that we are dependent on, so that our dependence would be exclusively on your Son. Help us trust in him. In Jesus' matchless name.